Hello guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. So today we'll be looking into constructor in depth part 3, and most probably it is the last part of constructor in depth. It will be a very short video and it is constructor constructor plus inheritance plus exception handling. This is the combination of constructor inheritance and exception handling, and we have already seen about the constructor plus inheritance. Now we'll be adding new called as exception handling. So how the constructor with inheritance and exception handling works? For that, let's see a simple example. Otherwise we can look into the our old code, last video code. We can see there something called as we develop super. Let's see, if we have exception, then how it will behave. Okay, and I think all of you know about the exception. We are having two broad categories of exception. One is checked exception, another one is unchecked exception. Checked exception means these are the exception. If we don't handle those exceptions, compiler will give us compilation error, and they are the direct child of exception class. Similarly, if an exception is there, means there is a chance of rising of exception, and we don't handle it and compiler won't complain anything, that is what is called as unchecked exception, and they are the child of runtime exception. We'll see exception handling in a separate topic. And exception handling, two categories. Unchecked example is runtime exception, arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, and checked exception is class not found exception, file not found exception, this kind of exception. So how it will behave if we are having like that? Okay, now we are having a simple class super, which is having, let it be a very simple, let's make it super default constructor, class sub default constructor. And in order for something to the output, because until unless we see the output, how can we believe, right? So println simple, I will write here super class, and here I will write subclass. Okay, let's create the object. Sub is equal to new sub, and that's it only. We don't have any method. Now let's compile and execute the code. Let it be java c space sub.java. No issues, compiler is very happy with our code. Sub, what will the output? You know, superclass, subclass, because in the last videos we have seen, when you create a subclass object, first the superclass object is created. Okay, now let's say the superclass constructor throws something called as the IO exception. If we compile it, it will give you the error, because you have to import java.io.io exception. Now my superclass constructor throws IO exception. Code compiles and executes sub. See, what is the error? Unreported exception, IO exception, must be caught or declared to be thrown. So what do you mean by this, and why this error is coming? What do you mean by this and why this error is coming? It is saying at the sub position, if you see line number 9, it is saying unreported exception, but exception is thrown in the parent class, right, in the super class. So what is the relationship within subclass? What is the relationship within the subclass? Yes, there is relationship, because we have already discussed, if we write default constructor, compiler automatically adds super here. That means constructor is calling this parent class constructor. And as per the calling and caller principle in exception handling, when we are calling a function or a constructor which is throwing one exception, so it is our responsibility to handle the exception here. Now it is our responsibility here to handle the exception. But sir, how many ways we can handle the exception? We can handle 2 ways, we know. We can write try catch to handle the exception, or we can again propagate the exception to the next column. So can we write try catch here? Try catch, can we write? Yes, no, we cannot write, because if we write try catch here, the super principle is broken, because super principle is saying super must be the first line inside the constructor. That means we cannot write try catch, and we are having the only option through the same exception. Now let's see. Unreported exception, IO exception must be cut or declared to be thrown sub equal to new sub. So what is this error now? This is at line number 15. Same concept applied here, calling and caller. Now you are calling the subclass constructor. You are calling the subclass constructor. That means this is invoked and this constructor is throwing exception. So now here we are have to handle the exception. Also here 2 ways: propagate the exception or write try catch. Propagate the exception or write try catch. Acha, we have propagated the exception, now no error. Can you say here super is called by sub, so it is the sub's responsibility to handle the exception, so we propagated it. Now we are calling sub new sub, we are calling here, so here we are also propagating, and whenever we are calling it here also we are propagating. That means propagation is going on. This superclass constructor propagates the exception to sub propagates the exception to main. Then who is the final to whom the main is propagating? That is the JVM will handle the exception. And also here we can have also try catch. We can write try and we can write here catch. IO exception, same thing, because here there is no rule first line second line, right? Compile, fine. Then suppose here it throws IO exception and here it throws exception. Then see how it will behave. No error. That means important takeaway here: if a superclass constructor is throws an exception, then subclass constructor which calls superclass constructor must throw either same or any super level exception, super level exception, or simple say parent exception. What do you mean by this? If we analyze this, if a superclass constructor throws an exception, then subclass constructor which calls superclass constructor must throw either the same or any super level or parent exception. That means who is the parent of IO exception? Whoever may be, any other, but we know exception is the parent of all. If I will write here exception, then it will work. That means if it is IO exception, so then subclass can throw same exception or parent of IO exception, that is nothing but exception here. Cool, right? And another important to note here, this exception is for only checked exception, not for unchecked exception. For example, if I will write here runtime exception, and I will not handle any kind of exception, right? Nothing is going to happen because JVM won't complain for unchecked exception. Compile. Nice. So what we understood from here, whenever one parent class throws an exception, checked exception, then while calling in the child class constructor, it must throw either the same exception or the parent exception or the super exception of that exception, checked exception, mind you. And we in the constructor, we can't handle the exception because we are calling super. If we write try catch, then super principle, the first line inside the constructor will be broken. So we have to only propagate the exception, and whoever that general the main function called the constructor, he has to handle it or again propagate to the JVM. Okay, so that's all completes for exception handling with constructor with inheritance. So it completes the 3 videos for a constructor in depth. So next video I will come up with other new things. Thanks for watching the video.